High on a hill was a grand castle. This castle was home to King Alexander. King Alexander was loved by everyone. He was kind and very wise. But King Alexander was different. He had a limp, and sometimes it was hard for him to walk. The people of the kingdom loved King Alexander. They brought him gifts, they sang him songs. The king was always happy to see his people. He would smile and wave his hand. The inside of the castle was beautiful. There were high ceilings and long hallways. Colorful flags hung from the walls. Sparkly chandeliers lit up the rooms. The castle was King Alexander's home, and he loved it very much. At the end of every day, King Alexander would go to his balcony. He would look out at his kingdom. The king was happy. He had so much love for his people. King Alexander had a wish. He wanted a portrait of himself. He wanted the portrait to hang in the castle. It would remind him of his people. The king called for all the painters in the kingdom. Painters came from all over. They brought their brushes and paints. Each painter wanted to paint the king's portrait. The painters all met in a grand hall. The king sat on his throne. He told them about his wish. He wanted a portrait that showed his kindness. The king's advisors whispered to each other, "How will the painters show the king's kindness?" they wondered. The king's kindness came from his heart. It was not something you could see with your eyes. The painters listened to the king. They looked at each other. Some painters frowned, others scratched their heads. Painting the king would be very difficult. Many painters gave up right away. "This is impossible," they cried. "We cannot paint kindness." They packed up their paints and brushes and left the castle. They didn't believe they could paint the king's portrait. The painters who stayed behind were worried. They looked at the king. The king was kind, that was for sure. But the king also had a limp. They did not know how to paint that. They wanted to show the king's kindness, but they also wanted to show respect. The painters thought about all the things the king did. They thought about how he helped people. They thought about how he made them laugh. But they still didn't know how to paint him. One by one, the painters gave up. They told the king it was too hard. They could not paint a portrait that showed his true self. Soon there was only one painter left. The last painter was a young man. He was not afraid of a challenge. He looked at the king. He thought about the king's kindness. The young painter smiled. He knew exactly what to do. The young painter took out his brush and paints. He worked for days. He painted and painted. Finally, the portrait was ready. The king called all of his people together. He wanted them to see the portrait too. The king sat on his throne. He was excited to see the portrait. The young painter stood next to his work. He was nervous but also proud. He pulled back the curtain. The portrait was revealed. The people gasped. The portrait did not show the king's limp. It did not show his face. It showed the king's hand. The king's hand was outstretched. It was the same hand the king used to help people. It was the same hand the king used to greet his people. The king was so happy. The portrait was perfect. It showed his true self. The people cheered. They loved the portrait too. It reminded them of their kind king. The king learned a valuable lesson that day. He learned that true beauty comes from within, and he learned that a picture is worth 1,000 words.